Welcome back, everyone, to the Fly Culture podcast. I'm really, really pleased today to be joined by angler, writer, TV presenter and photographer Matt Hayes. He didn't really need any introduction. I'm sure you'll know him, but I wanted to say the many things that he's done, and hopefully we'll cover those within the podcast today. But Matt, thanks so much for dropping by and talking with me today. How are you doing?
I'm fine, Pete. I'm holed up in Norway, not too far from the Gowler River, riding out the virus, etc., and looking forward to Christmas.
Yeah. It must have been an interesting one. I don't know how the restrictions and things worked over there in Norway. Did you have a lockdown as such, or did you just sort of let things go and people were allowed to move around and that herd mentality thing? Did that work for the virus?
They didn't do the herd thing in Norway. They did that very much in Sweden, where there's sort of mixed reports about whether it's worked or not. Over here, we did have a lockdown initially during March when the whole thing kicked off. I'd actually been across in the UK at the Northern Angling Show, so I had to get back over here pretty quickly to avoid being stuck in the UK away from the family. And then we were locked down-ish for about 4 or 5 weeks. But to be honest, we've got a lot of space here. So lockdown hasn't really affected us. Population density is low in Norway. And that's one of the reasons I think why quality of life and freedom and all that sort of thing, if you're a fisherman, is so high. So we've had an easy ride compared to you guys, mate. We've been fine. One of the big worries was during the summer, of course, we've got a hugely international clientele here who come to our fishing lodge. And we were very concerned about how it would affect us. And it did. I mean, basically, we put our UK and other international visitors, we put them into next year, into 2021, secured the deposits, just rebooked them, and then we sold rods on the spot market, last year. So mainly to Norwegians. A few Danes and Swedes snuck in for a while, and then things changed in Denmark and they weren't allowed in. So it was quite a perilous year, and one which was very difficult for anybody running fishing on the river. But we weathered that. We've been established as a fishing lodge in this incarnation with myself and Anna Morit for over 10 years. But of course, historically, the place has been looking after fishermen since 1882. So it would have been a shame if something had stopped that tradition.
Does that mean that you managed to get out fishing yourself?
I do. Not as much as I'd like. I mean, I guess everybody watching and listening to this now will probably say the same thing, because I think no matter how much fishing you get, it's never enough, really. But as time has gone by, I've become less fixated on my own fishing, and I genuinely do enjoy seeing other people catch fish, and a lot of the other things around the sport interest me, such as the photography and fly tying, the company, the whole culture surrounding fishing really interests me, and I get great pleasure from that. And that sustains me through the dark winter months, Pete, when there's no fishing here because the river over there is frozen quite a lot of the time. And when it isn't frozen, it's very, very cold. Fishing's 3 months of the year here, pretty much. That's river fishing. So I have to come back to the UK to go coarse fishing, occasionally game fishing. It's in the winter, really, that I miss the fishing the most. When I hear about a nice, mild winter's day, I think about chub and perch in the UK or predator fishing, and it hurts sometimes. But I do get to go. I come back, fish with Mick, fish with my other mates, and I really cherish that. But in the summer, I don't get to go as much as I'd like. Theoretically, I could go every day. Because I run the fishing here and it's run according to my rules. But I don't like fishing in front of the guests. If they've got a pool coming up, I don't like jumping in front of them. We'll probably come on to it later in terms of the way in which we run the river, and in terms of salmon fishing, because it's a bit different to the norm on this river and probably generally. So I don't like to buck my own system, and it does cost me quite a lot of fishing, but I catch quite a few salmon each season when so I do all right.
Yeah, that's good to hear. It's interesting that rewinding a tiny little bit there, where you talk about, it's the bigger picture of the fishing that you really love, and it's come up a few times on these podcasts. And do you think that view that you don't have to be thrashing the water to a foam, I'm here, I've got a fish, I've got a fish. Do you think that comes with maturity as well?
Yes, I don't think that there can be any doubt about that. I think my enthusiasm to fish as a young man, middle-aged man, was really unparalleled. I mean, I had an immense desire not to compete with other people, but to achieve what I wanted to achieve. And I just couldn't get enough fishing, and in the early days of filming the Great Rod Race, I nearly sacked the crew because they just couldn't keep up. In hindsight, Mick was by then, Mick's older than me, so he was slightly more laid back, but it's the same with him. He goes fishing less than he used to, but he probably still goes 3 or 4 times a week. And that's light.
Yeah.
So yes, I think so, mate. I think you get to the point where in the beginning you just want to catch as many fish as you can. Then you go to a stage where you want to catch big fish, and then after that, I think you reach another phase, if you fish long enough, if you fish enough, where you're more selective about how and where and why and who with you want to catch them. It's just called growing up, really, and growing old, I suppose. I look at the fishing scene as it is now, which I'm still very much part of. Social media has been a big thing for me because it's enabled me to make a living when other people in this industry have fallen off the edges and struggled. So I'm not anti-tech. As someone who makes films and does a lot of photography, I see the benefits of it, but there is a focus on the end result nowadays, not on the fishing itself. And the literature has suffered. The great writers, I think, that we enjoyed in the days of yore are very few left now, and none coming through, which is worrying. And I always found literature very inspiring. If I wanted to go and fish for roach, I'd read a book about roach fishing and it would fire me up. So I think there's a downside to the modern technology, and particularly with regard to digital and social, and that is you don't have to strive too hard to get anything anymore. Knowledge that took you years to achieve and was hard won is now instant, as is knowledge of where everybody else is fishing. So it's moving much faster. I understand that, but I think there is a cheapening of the fishing itself and the experience of learning to fish, learning watercraft. It took years and years and years to learn how to do something before we had, the modern situation. I mean, we're using technology to speak now. So I don't intend to be hypocritical, but there is a downside to it. And the downside is the fishing, the joy of the fishing, rather than the, hey, look at what I've caught, the 5 minutes of fame, and then you move on. So that I think is an issue which the sport is facing. But Pete, I see youngsters out fishing today who seem to be absolutely crazy for it. But when I think back, I was just the same. And I think I'd love to be able to feel what's in their heart or what's in their fishing soul, because that's the key. Fishing to me has been, I think Mick put it really well once. I made a documentary of him called The Pike and I. and I filmed it. And I said to him, look, let's make a film about you, because, you know, most tribute things are done when people are brown bread. And I said, you've still got loads of life in you. Let's go out and make this thing about why you pike fish. Let's just make this thing about Mick Brown. So I made it as a friend, and we were sitting on the bank. I was interviewing, and he said, there's part of me that needs this. Without it, I love my family, I love my life, but without this, I'm not quite complete. I'm not quite right. And that, I think, is something which I can agree with many fishermen do. So, very long-winded answer. There's good and bad, but I'd like to peer into the souls of some of the current fishing stars to gauge their mettle.
Yeah.
You know, to judge, because there's every chance that they're just as enthusiastic as I was, Pete. Times have moved on, but the passion for fishing remains, I think.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully put as well. And I love your analogy from Mick there as well. And that's just absolutely hit the nail on the head, hasn't it? And being complete. And even if it's just 20 minutes on the water or walking by the water, sometimes that is enough to recharge the soul, or it feels like it does anyway.
You're absolutely right. I mean, you said to me, how much fishing can you do? How much fishing I do is relatively unimportant. You know, I've travelled all over the world. I've caught all sorts of fish. Of course, there's fish I'd like to catch. I want to catch a 40-pound salmon, or at least land one. And it's good to have outstanding ambitions. But the fact that I can go is what really counts. The fact that I can walk across the river, if I really want to, I can go and fish. That's what counts. The amount of time I spend fishing is less important than the principle that I'm not a caged bird, you know.
Yeah, good points. Let's take it back then, because you talked about when you were a youngster, and where did that fishing journey begin for you? Where was it that you realised, yes, this is for me? Did you grow up, and I was similar, that you played football, you played cricket, you did fishing, you did all those other sorts of things that went with it? But when did you realise that fishing was becoming a larger part of your life?
That's a really good question. I think it was always there. When my dad took me to the water, both of my grandfathers were fishermen. Two more different characters you couldn't imagine. My dad's dad was a bus driver, loved his coarse fishing. And I remember trips with him. He used to swear like a trooper, and he was the crudest fisherman you could imagine. My grandmother on my mum's side was a good, very, very, very good all-round fisherman. And he used to match fish, but he could also fly fish. And he used to spend many, many weekends away in Wales, mainly fishing for sea trout and salmon. And my nan told me they used to have a caravan holiday. She said, I took vegetables, but I didn't take any meat, because Dave would catch enough fish for the week, you know, sea trout and salmon. He was mustard keen and extremely good at all forms of fishing. But they were both great characters. I remember going fishing with them and my dad and my Uncle Colin from the age of probably 3, from my first memories. I remember going to Liso's Park in Halesowen with my dad with a tiddler net to catch tadpoles in the spring, to Edgbaston Reservoir to try and catch sticklebacks. Water fascinated me, Pete. It drew me like an iron filing to a magnet. And I've always been happy by water, whether it was with, you know, a little fishing net in my hand or moving on to rod and line. Earliest memories fishing on the canal, Staff's Worcester Canal by the Stewed Pony Pub, which isn't there now in that area. Fishing for gudgeon. Sometimes we caught a roach, like a 6-ounce roach was highlight of the day, you know, in among 100 gudgeon. And if we fished under a tree, I can remember, quite often we caught a big perch. I mean, I'd like to say they were £1.5, £2, but that's a boy's memories, you know. But I think it was instant. It was like giving an addict, you know, crack cocaine or something. It's just bang, that was it. I went and I was hooked, and it's never, it's always been my passion, my interests, everything. My life has been, you know, dictated by my passion for fishing. It shaped my destiny. I like to think I'm putting something back now. Try to be a more responsible human being. But the truth is that I'm like a leaf on a stream that's I've just, you know, just drifted with the stream. I've gone where it's taken me. I'm, you know, there's no doubt about that. I am where I am now because of fishing. If it wasn't for fishing, I wouldn't be here. So, mate, I just can't. I can't really answer that. I don't remember anything growing within me. I just remember this instant connection, this love. And people might think that what I've done and what Mick's done is partly driven by commercialism or Z-list celebrity, whatever. And it isn't. It never has been. That's never, ever been important to me. It's only been about fishing. And that's why you mentioned that I've changed incarnations so many times. You know, I cut my teeth and made my reputation as a coarse fisherman. And then I discovered particularly lure fishing, which I loved and still love. Still love all forms of very tactile, you know, sport fishing where you can see or feel the bite, feel or seal it even. And then along came fly fishing, and I was fighting with a lack of ability. You know, my casting was terrible, but I worked on that, and I practiced, and I just spent more time with a fly rod in my hand. In the early days, I got away with a lack of casting ability because I'm a good fisherman and I can get close to fish and I can see opportunities perhaps that other people can't, where they sort of bumble around and there's a fish right underneath them that's there to be caught. But I used that to mask the inherent problem. And when I learned to cast, and I think, you know, the day came when you go out fishing, you don't even think about which direction the wind's blowing, because you know it's not going to stop you, and it's, you know, as a fly fisherman, you'll cope with it. That's the day you graduated, I think. And I mean, I love it. You know, these days, fly fishing is everything to me, because you know, you get to the stage where you want to do things by the most difficult route, the most skillful way, if you like. And for me, that's fly fishing. But the other peripherals around my angling career, they don't matter. They don't matter. I've done, you know, I've had my cake and eat it. I've followed that stream. I've immersed myself in it. I've enjoyed it to the full. I owe the sport of fishing a tremendous debt of gratitude, because, you know, I am a compulsive character. And there have been points in my life where, you know, I've had battles. I don't want to over dramatize this, with certain aspects of my mental health. And I believe that without fishing, I might not have been in quite as good a place. So I don't know, but I can assure you it's been nothing to do with the notoriety or you know, anything associated with that. I'm not interested in that. I never have been, and I'm not now.
Nice. It's been really interesting, Matt. And I know we were talking off mic as well, that, you know, I remember those programs from the very, very early days. And they were the soundtrack for on a Saturday morning on Sky. My daughter and I would sit down and watch the programs, Total Fishing, I remember, and it was quite clear. And as an instructor as well, you could see your curve of fly fishing move on. But what I really appreciated about it was the honesty. And you said, and I remember you fishing in one of the first series, I think it was in Normandy for trout, and you were doing a little bit then, and then how it moved on. I remember you fishing in Ireland, and doing a little bit there, and then on the Lower Itchen, which was a really lovely one that where Mick wanted to catch a fish on his dad's rod, and all those sorts of things. But you could see that interest. And then for me, that Gowler particularly, and it seems, as you say, how you followed that stream literally. And that was a really fascinating program that you'd set on the Gowler, and the fishing was tough, wasn't it?
Yes, yes, but the honesty. I think all the shows I've made have been about honesty. But you talk about Total Fishing and watching it with your daughter. It is only now, all those years on, when people come up to me and say, "I grew up with you." It makes me feel terribly old. The time goes like that. That I've realised how influential it was on people, and because I've always been a slightly maverick character as far as the angling industry goes, Pete. Truth to tell, and over the years of my popularity, it has bucked the trend of the industry narrative. There have been times when the industry has wanted to select its own man or woman, and I've spoilt that party sometimes. It's about grassroots. It's about connection with people. I was tempted to say ordinary people. Nobody's ordinary. But I'm talking about people who don't have the privilege of going fishing as often as I do, or making a living out of it, or attached to the angling industry in some respect. I'm talking about anglers the length and breadth of the country. I'm the same as them. And when I made those programs, if I got frustrated with myself because I wasn't good enough at something, all it made me was more determined to crack it in the end, which is what actually brought me back to Gowler. We made an episode of Lake Escapes, and it was a series where we were going, I say we, it's not the royal we, but I had a crew of people who I worked with, and we came to Norway as part of this series, and it was short fishing breaks all over Europe. So we went to Madeira, we went to the Azores, we went to Poland and Ireland and all over the place. And one of the places we were going to was Norway. Came to the Gowler, never been fishing for salmon with a double hand rod before. I think I'd only ever caught one on a single hand on the River Moy. It was the only time I'd tried. You struggle if you're on the ridge pool and you can't catch a salmon. And anyway, we ended up coming to the Gowler, and I remember I'd got a Loomis 14-foot 910 Stinger, and anybody that knows that rod will realise that it's possibly it is one of the greatest salmon rods ever made in modern times for casting, but your timing has to be good. I had an uncut shooting head in the days when they needed to be cut back. Nobody told me that you've got to have the right weight and length of line. I just used it uncut, and I obviously couldn't cast this thing apart from overhead. So I spent 2 days up to my tits in the Gowler, the water was very cold. I had a leak in both legs of my waders in the end. So I was freezing for 2 days, but I would not give in. I think I got one pull. And for most people, that would be enough. They'd say, no more, I'm done with that. But for me, it was like red rag to a bull. And I resolved that I would come back and I would catch a salmon from this river. But that program was typically, brutally honest. When I communicate on camera with people, I imagine talking to people and you can't kid fishermen, Pete. They're not stupid, most of them. They've got great instincts. Then, you know, the ones that follow fishing, they can spot a bullshitter a mile off, and there's no point in even trying in my eyes. You know, it's about respecting. You're honest. You've got to say, listen, I struggle with this, because that's real. That, you know, who hasn't gone out and struggled with something?
Yeah.
You know, had a bad day, not able to cast. You know, and had someone stand next to them who's a bit of a novice catch. Oh, look, they're easy to catch. You know, we've all had it. Everybody's had it. So why pretend differently? You know, obviously you've got to make television. You've got to make a television show. If you're out to catch fish for the camera, there is no getting away from the fact that if you regularly fail, you will not get the work. That's a fact, because people's time costs money, and if you cock it up often enough, you'll soon be off screen. So it goes without saying that a certain level of ability is required, and a certain level of determination, and an understanding that your job when you go and make that program is to recreate as closely as you can a normal day's fishing. And I say recreate because on a normal day, you don't get in and out the car 3 times before you set up. You don't walk up and down the path 3 times because so you can get a certain shot. You don't stand in that spot just because the light's nice there. But if you know, once you begin to understand making films, you do that stuff, because otherwise, when you watch the footage back, you think, well, that's not how I remember the day. Well, that doesn't look very good. Oh no, that's, you know. So television is like that. Any film is like that. You are trying to portray what it's really like, because you can't, the technology doesn't exist at the moment to be able to film something beautifully enough to make it interesting in real time. If you watch it in real time, it looks like what it is. It looks like reality TV. It's 1 or 2 camera angles. It's a bit rough around the edges. And that may be what people want. And there is a place for that. But if you want to celebrate the beauty of angling and what you feel in your heart when you go fishing, you've got to graft at that. So yes, in some ways you do recreate it. The fishing, the actual catching of fish is the part that is truly spontaneous. It's the exciting part when things can, you know, you're going off script and you're going off piste. So, you know, I hope that's a very honest answer to
Absolutely.
an interesting question.
And do you think that series Lake Escapes was a tipping point for you as well from a fly fishing point of view? Because I remember that one really well. And like you say, the honesty of it, as I said earlier as well, was to me really cool. And then you went somewhere else I think there may have been 2 places in Scandinavia, weren't there? One where you stayed in the tent, and I remember you catching trout on caddis patterns and things like that. And I think you swung one downstream to catch them, which was really cool. But do you think that was the starting point for the love affair with fly fishing growing some more, and also with Scandinavia too?
With Scandinavia, yes. The love of fly fishing began really when I went to Cuba in the late 90s with a friend of mine, Simon Bond. And at the time, Simon and myself were working with Shimano. Simon was the marketing director. And he signed me on as an ambassador. And I remember David Hall, who's dead now, sadly. He basically said, "Oh, you know, who is this bloke? What is Shimano doing?" And a lot of established industry figures did the same thing, with the exception, I have to say, of John Wilson, who was always extremely complimentary about me, encouraged me, and behaved in a truly gentlemanly, professional way, for which he'll always have my undying admiration. A great professional, John. But nonetheless, this character turned up that nobody really wanted to have much to do with, because they could see I was going to kick some ass and upset the establishment, and I did. But during that period at Shimano, we booked what is now quite a notorious and infamous trip to Cuba. And Shimano decided to have one of their famous sales conferences there, in which they invited their fishing tackle dealers from all over Europe to go and attend this conference in Havana. Well, at that time, it really was. You hear all sorts of stuff I've seen it in fly fishing magazines and seen people on film and stuff talking about how they really pioneered fishing in Cuba. No, they didn't. I can tell you where Cuba fishing started. It started on one day on that trip, and we were sitting in the bar of the Havana Cohiba Hotel, beautiful hotel. And a Dutch guy walked in. Dave Lewis was there, the sea fisherman, me, Bondi, and a few other fishing tackle dealers. And a Dutch guy, who I can't remember his name, walked in, and he said, "Lads," he said, "does anybody want to go fishing?" It's like, "Yeah, we'll go." Where? And he said, "Don't worry about that." "Well, what are we fishing for?" He said, "Bonefish." Well, we didn't know what bonefish were, really. We'd heard of them, but if you'd said to me, "Draw a bonefish," I'd have got it half right, but it wouldn't have been a proper bonefish. And what do they eat? Oh, don't worry about that. So we piled into this bus. There was 20 of us. Most of them were Dutch. And most people, in fact, all people, nobody had got a fly rod, Pete. Nobody had got a fly rod or any flies. All we had was spinners and rapalas. And we went down to a place called Las Salinas. And it's in Matanzas. And you'd have to drive down a causeway and a bumpy old track, which goes on forever and ever and ever and ever. And eventually we came to the end of this place, and it's very near to the Bay of Pigs. And at the end of it, there's a hut and a mast and a group of elderly people whose job ostensibly is to watch the wild birds in the area and nature. And their secondary task is to be eyes and ears, because Castro was still alive at that time. And they were there to make sure that nobody invaded, basically, and shouldn't be there. And they used these tiny little plastic skiffs, almost injection molded, with a bamboo push pole. Well, they started poling us out onto this water that's about 1 foot to 18 inches deep, and we think, we're not going to be anything here, All of a sudden, they start saying, "Maccabee, Maccabee," and we say, "Oh, what's that all about?" And then we saw the shoals of bonefish. And there were so many that people were casting rapalas into the middle, and they were just blowing out into huge showers. But that day, on rapalas and spinners, we caught quite loads. That's how aggressive they were. On rapalas that big. Loads of them. I'll tell you something else about bonefish as well in a minute. Anyway, it was an amazing experience. And at that time, you'd got Pepe and I think it was Francesco. They had the operation at Jardines de la Reina. That was just starting up. So that's where it started. It was exactly at that point. And anybody that tells you anything else is bullshitting, mate. That's where it started. And me and Simon wanted to go back. And we did go back. We were so inspired by it. We said, we've got to do this the right way. This is, unbelievable, these fish. We went back within 6 months, within 3 months, with fly rods, Penn 2.5G saltwater fly reels, still got them, absolutely bulletproof, beautiful things. We bought 2 or 3 each, 7 to 9 weight rods. We both copped off with Cuban women permanently. Simon's still married to one. I was with one for a lady for a long time, and we ended up getting divorced. But I lived on and off in Havana and around that area for the next God knows how long. We made Buena Vista Fishing Club there, where I didn't just go to the same old tired places. We went all over Cuba. You know, we went to Santa Clara, we went to Santiago de Cuba, and it was magic. And I ended up, I've got a letter actually from Fidel Castro thanking me for my research into fishing in Cuba.
Wow, that's pretty impressive.
So I hear all the talk, mate, but the reality is that is where it started. And that passion for bonefish, permit, and tarpon, that is where it really ignited. But as time went by, I then began to think, going with Tony and Ichtid, you were talking about those before we started here, talking about sea trout fishing. And I got interested in sea trout fishing through Tony Davis and Ichtid Griffiths, who you know well. And they took me and Mick sea trout fishing. Mick enjoyed it, but, you know, that was it for him. For me, no, that was a different thing. Night fishing for sea trout, which I did quite a bit of around that time. If people say to me, if you had one last day of fishing left to choose, what would it be? And of course, people are disappointed if I don't say chub or something like, or carp or something like that. But the truth is, it would probably be a night fishing for sea trout, big sea trout, because it's such a sensual experience. You know, because you can't see, you have to cast by feel and sense of timing. But to feel that tug when it comes out of the blue, and if it's a big sea trout, you hear it turn over on the surface. And I just think it don't get any better than that, to be honest. 9, 10, 11, 12 pound sea trout in the night on a single hand rod. I tell you, that takes a beating, especially on a surface lure. So anyway, that's a digression. But you can tell from the way I'm describing this that having got that sea trout experience, you know, my grandfather loved migratory cold water game fish, and immediately I began to fish the Towie particularly a lot more. But I also I went up and I fished the Typhy with a very young Stephen Jones. And I mean, Stephen was a kid then, but he was working as a fishing guide. And it was obvious to me when I met him that I thought, this kid knows his stuff. Age is irrelevant with, you know, it's the same as with football. If they're good enough, they're good enough. And I've met several young people who I've learned a lot from, you know. So Stefan was one of them, and we had great nights on the Tyvee, and then I went on the Towie and fished there. In fact, and then the Cleddau, fishing with Tony, particularly Tony Davis, trying to chase mullet on the fly, some of the biggest mullet I've ever seen in that river. That's another challenge. So I think it really took off in that period between bonefish, permit, and then going into cold water game fish. And when I came to Norway, it's very difficult to describe really, but I just felt I'd come home. I can't say it any other way than that. I'm quite happy here. I mean, I'm a rough-ass black country lad, you know, on the hinterland between the black country and Birmingham. I love football. I love Saturday afternoons. I love going to the match, the smell of it, the pies. You know, I love many, many things about Britain, but I feel at home here. I always have. I came and, you know, because of a love really of the place more than anything. There's a classic joke. I came here, I met Anna Marit, my wife, who is just, she's the one who's really tamed me without actually caging me up, and that was the key, really. She supported everything I've done, and she's never tried to cage me, and because of that, she succeeded in keeping me very close to home. But people make a joke about, about the daughter of the landowner, with part of the Gowler River, which part of that don't you like? There's always been this joke that it's the classic one, isn't it? Of you look in the newspaper and you put an advert in where you're looking for a wife, and with a stretch of river, please send picture of stretch. It's that syndrome. So there were many Danes and many Swedes who absolutely loathed and detested me when I got together with Anna Marie, and still do, because of that, because I thwarted a lot of ambitions there. But honestly, mate, that's not it. I've always been able to blacksmith fishing if I want it. I can fish anywhere in the world if I want to. Honestly, I can. That's not it. Having the river now, Gowler is. I do feel very bound to it, and I feel very passionate about trying to preserve it for future generations. But when I came out here, I genuinely wasn't looking for any sort of new relationship. I certainly wasn't looking to move to Norway or into Scandinavia, but that's what happened. And with Gowler, to tell you the truth, salmon fishing isn't my favourite form of fly fishing. I would probably put sea trout, as I've said to you before, and brown trout certainly on dry flies and emergers ahead of salmon as something to do. I do love salmon, and I love catching salmon, but there's a lot of dull moments in between with salmon fishing. You can go down a salmon river and fish a pool through, and if someone says to you, what would you do differently? When you realise that you probably wouldn't have done anything differently, then you realise how frustrating salmon fishing can be. Sometimes it's a game of chance. There are things that you can do to tip the balance. There are some people who are better at salmon fishing than others, and we can talk about that if you want, because I've seen a lot of fishing.
Matt, I think it would be really, really interesting, if possible, to get some of those tips then from what you see as somebody who's on the river a lot. What sort of advice would you give people about their salmon fishing?
Well, one of the reasons why I believe that dry fly fishing and emerger fishing for brown trout is more skillful than salmon fishing is because there is a key. If you can work out what the fish are feeding on and at what stage of the hatch they're, and then you can provide a fly that imitates that, there is no finer school to follow in pure fishing terms. To understand entomology, to understand hatches, to understand that unlike stocked fish, wild fish are driven by wild instincts. So a wild fish is worth 10, 20, 30 stockies. I came to recognise that years and years ago. And, there's no doubt about it. There are plenty of people who are skillful who fish for rainbow trout. But in my league of merit, it's quite low. Wild fish are where it's at. But I realise that not everybody can fish for wild fish. It's a tremendous privilege. So with brown trout, I think that is the ultimate school. If you want to become the ultimate fisherman, my advice is you end up there. You don't start there, but you end up there. But with salmon fishing, there is this rogue element where you can fish wonderfully. You can choose the right fly. You can cast perfectly and still not catch a fish. If there is not a taking fish in that pool, you ain't going to catch it. So salmon are one of the most frustrating of all fish, really, because you can't force them into something. With a trout, you know, you can tempt it to some extent. I mean, perhaps with the salmon, yes, if you put a fly down deep and stick it in its face, you might get an aggressive reaction. But, you know, I think people often invent narratives about what's happened after the event. They do it in coarse fish and they'll say, oh, yeah, I was casting on that gravel bar. There's no gravel bar there. They think there is. And I think that happens with salmon fishing. Oh, yeah, I put on one of these and I did that. And then, that really works. I honestly believe that salmon fishing is largely a game of chance. Now, on rivers like this one, which is not easy, it doesn't suffer fools gladly here. Gowler fish, like a fly, fished at speed, much faster than you'd fish it in Scotland. These fish are genetically, very powerful, very used to cold water, incredibly robust, and they like a fly going quite quickly. And you need to cast well generally. To catch fish consistently on this river, you need to cast well. If you don't, you just won't catch many fish. But once you reach a certain level, I believe there aren't that many things that you can do. But what can you do to improve your chances? One of the biggest influences on my fishing career in salmon fishing is Laurie Hickman. I mean, Laurie was a very successful match fisherman in coarse fishing, but also caught many salmon. And in fact, one of the things which always amused me about Laurie was I said to him, so you're match fishing during the weeks. He fished for the Daiwa team. He was really good. He was on the fringes of the England team, mates with Ivan Marks and Roy Marlowe and all the rest of them. And but at the weekend, he used to go salmon fishing. I said, well, how did you, it's an interesting social sort of mix there. How did you manage that? He said, it was easy. I bought a pipe and a cravat. But he said, I had to give up the pipe in the end because he kept burning my tongue. And I love Laurie because he's always been honest with me. And we were fishing once. We were on the Dee at Park, I think. Was it at Park? Anyway, it was snowing. And I remember that day I caught a salmon in the snow, which it was great. I've got a picture of it, But anyway, there was a fish showing on the far side under this tree. It was quite a long throw. And I couldn't quite get there most casts. Occasionally I'd get to it, Laurie came wandering along the bank and he said, he watched me for a bit. And then we went back to the hut at lunchtime. He said, yeah, how are you getting on? I said, this fish. He said, what? She said, so you need to learn to cast within your limits, mate. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you're trying to cast too far. He said, you can't cast that far. Therefore, your presentation isn't very good. And years later, or a couple of years later on the Gowler, I began to realise how true that is. Because you want that fly to start swimming the minute it touches the water. Gowler fish, bang, they'll have it. And quite often as it touches the water, as it turns over, wallop. You think, how have they seen that so quick? How have they caught that fly so quick? But what you don't want in your setup is a load of slack. You don't want a fly that's wafting around. No good. That fly needs to hit the water and start swimming. So he was right. I was trying to cast further than I could. Now, yes, I could make the cast fairly easily. But at the end of the day, you have to fish within your limits. So that's my first piece of advice to people. Fish within your limits, fish neat, fish with the line stretched out. Secondly, fish quietly. Don't treat salmon like a clumsy big fish. Salmon are just as wary as trout or any other salmonoid species. They're wild fish. They've come into the river after, a year or two spent at sea. They're not used to footfall. They're not used to disturbance. They're not used to things standing over the top of them. And since they were par, they've instinctively learned to avoid moving shadows. Flash, anything that, it's just instinctive. So I think approaching the water with a bit of respect and a little bit circumspect on the first run down the pool. Have a quiet run down, fish gently before you go in with the sun ray and try and smash it to the other side. And then I think the third thing, especially in low water, don't have concrete boots. People who have concrete wading shoes rarely do well in salmon fishing. Fish through the pool quickly. It's very, very important that you do. And in low water, you want to be taking 7 or 8 steps between casts. Because on this river, the water's so clear, Pete. You know, the fish, I've filmed flies underwater. The fish can see your fly from 20, 30 meters away at times. I mean, don't kid yourself. So by the time it arrives in front of them, they've seen it about 10 times. Yeah. They know that it's not the right thing. But if you take a lot of steps, the chances are that it will come as a surprise. Because my obsession with salmon fishing, really, or I believe that the key to salmon fishing is the illusion of life. That the fish sees the fly at the last minute. And that drives everything. It drives how many steps you take between casts. It describes how quickly you fish the fly, but it also describes your choice of fly pattern. Now, Laurie Hickman said to me in those early days, he said, mate, he said, there isn't a salmon I've come across on the planet that won't take a willy gun. It might be a tube, it might be a double, but think about it. A willy gun is the perfect salmon fly. For a start off, it mixes all the great salmon fishing colours. But the point is it mixes them. So if you're fishing a willy gun with a stacked wing, say a modern temple dog with, you know, your yellow, your orange and your black, some people like a bit of red in there. If it's a stacked wing, that's not a willy gun. A willy gun is a mixture of fibres. So when you put it in the water, it's quite hard to see one individual colour because the contrast is mixed. You've got light, medium and dark fibres in a willy gun. Now you can control that. If you want the fly to be darker to show up more in coloured water or whatever, or in the evening, put a few more dark fibres in if you want to. But the point is that the willy gun is a fly that mixes contrast. So the salmon can't see it well. They can see it at the last minute, but they can't see it good. And to me, that principle, we use lots of flies here on Gap. We use a lot of green flies. Why do we use green flies? Why is, you know, Norway the only place in the world where green salmon flies work really well? Because of the tint in the water. Gowler is, the old word for Gowler comes from gul, which means yellow river. Well, yellow-green chartreuse is a true reflection. But the fly choice that we use on this river, when the river's low, especially early season, if it has a tint, it's a yellow-green. When the water rises in the autumn and we get lots of the forest runoff come in and debris, it has a browner, more whiskey type tinge. Then we often use flies with brown and orange. And it's all about playing with contrast. If the water's clear, you want the fly to blend in as much as possible to reflect the hues of the water so that the fish see it at the last minute. If the water's dirty, they've got to be able to see it. And the water will camouflage to some extent. So you get away with higher contrast flies like black and yellow, black and orange. But to me, that's the key to salmon fishing. Everything lies in what Falk has described as, if a fish could speak, it would say, what was that? Not, there it is. And if you keep that in here, it drives how you tie flies, what type of flies you use, how you fish them, the speed at which you fish them. It drives everything. So the key with salmon is the illusion of life.
Yeah. And do you play with size at all, Matt?
Do I what, sorry?
Size of flies. Do you change size of flies much, or do you stay pretty constant?
I do change. I mean, we start typically sort of early season. We start. Actually, somebody sent me some the other day. Because we do have flies here for our guests, but yeah, I mean, let's have a look here. What have I got? These here are very typical sort of Gowler flies. These are yellow green sort of colours. That's about a medium-sized tube. Pretty good all year round. Not so great sort of early season. And then let's see if we've got something else. Yeah, these are a bit more. Night fly, black. I've asked a tyer to do some of these weeks. So I tie flies, but I can't tie them quick enough. No, it's true actually. Here's a mixed fibre woolly gun here. So that would be a small early season fly for us, and that's a traditional willy gun. But more typically, we're using probably 4, 5, even 6-inch temple dog style flies, black and green, black, yellow and green. Sometimes with a bit of blue in as well if we've got some fresh fish in. And then by the time we come to the middle part of the season, we're probably on flies more of that sort of size, which is what, probably about 3 inches, something like that, 2.5 to 3 inches. And then by the time we come to the end of the season, we'll be down on wee doubles. And if the Gowler's really low, we'll be using something like size.
Wow.
Now, the interesting thing about this fly is this fly's got some bling in it. I don't like lots of flash in the flies. I think it puts the fish off, but it's got a bit, this temple dog here. This one's got none. And it's also got earth tone colours. It's a March brown double. That's what it is. It's got a hare's ear body, and it's got a traditional doubled wing. Very difficult to tie paired wings. Very difficult. If you're a fly tyer, that is the holy grail. If you can tie really good classic wet flies, you've cracked it. You're as good as anybody. But what we tend to do in the summer is start the season. We're using 4 to 6-inch temple dog tubes. A lot of black, yellow, and green. If the water comes up and it's got any dark colour in it, then yes, we'll look at black and orange or pure black. Is my advice in the flood. One of those two. But usually we flies with green in and black and green in them. Then we get into the mid-season. We're still using a lot of banana type flies to blend in with the tint in the water. But by this time, we'll be down to like 2.5 inches maximum. When we come to August, well, we're on very small tubes, micro tubes, small doubles, as I showed you there, 12s, 14s. And of course, you can never rule out a sunray shadow. You should always have some of those in your box. But a really interesting fly that I've used in the last couple of years is a fly that I call a half-arse, which is basically a sunray with a shorter wing, but no flash in it at all. And just bland. So when the fish have seen a lot of stuff, don't use flash, just use earth tone coloured flies that blend in. It's the same principle, Pete. It's the illusion of life, mate. The fish has got to see the fly, but you want it to see it at the last minute. If the water's coloured, it will see it at the last minute because of the colour in the water. Everything's more confused. There's leaves going down and there's more turbulence. But in clear water, it's the illusion of life. I'm telling you.
Nice tip.
I'm convinced that's the key.
Nice tip. Seeing those small flies reminded me of a piece Tom Clinton wrote for our magazine Fly Culture about they all came out with Alex Jardine to visit you and fish with you, with Toby Merrigan. There was Rob Thomas, I think. They were all over, all the bad boys. And it was incredibly low, but then the rain came and it was just an amazing, it turned out to be a phenomenal trip. And there's a picture of them looking over the bridge and counting all the salmon in the pool below. So it was absolutely fantastic.
Yes, we love those guys. They call themselves the Rain Bros, and Tom. Well, they're all great. They're all great lads, and I love having them here. They bring some youth and vitality to it because a lot of our customers are, like me, a bit getting on a bit. But I love their enthusiasm. I like spending time by the river with them, and it's so nice to get young folks here. It's all part of the sort of the culture of it, Pete. It's the celebration of fishing. I love spending time by the water with them and seeing their enthusiasm. And they're good fishers. They don't know everything, and on that trip they needed a bit of help from me and my gilly George, who really looked after them. But that was a classic case in point. They went from the river being low and clear, utter despair. We actually arranged for them to go down to the Strin River on the coast, and George, bless him, drove him down. Me and the missus, we picked up a motorhome, drove down with them, hired them a house, because the problem was it was so hot. I've got these guys coming. What can we do? It's just disaster. Everything's too warm. And I thought, well, glacial river. You could catch fish on a glacial river. So I arranged for them to have a couple of days trout fishing on this beautiful crystal clear river. And we drove down there with them. I cooked them curry at night. I remember that, for about 12 people. Never cooked for 12 people before. But I figured they were young and foolish and they wouldn't care even if it tasted like, So I cooked for them. And then George took them on. Sorry about that awful noise outside, by the way, Pete. One of the farmers is ploughing the field, everybody, if you can hear a bit of rumbling. Yeah, so then we took the guys down to the Strin, or George did. And while they were down there, I saw the weather forecast and I phoned them up and I said, look, lads, I think by Thursday night or Friday morning, this river's going to be game on. So I phoned them as soon as it started raining. I just knew, and I said, you better get back up here. So they packed everything away, came straight back. And thankfully it worked, because between the Friday afternoon, I think, a couple of them I managed to persuade to stay until the Tuesday, because we actually weren't fully booked the next week. And I said, look, just stay if you can, because the fishing is going to be absolutely amazing. And I forget how many fish they caught between that Friday and, I mean, one of them, Toby, I think he caught his last fish about 10 minutes after he should have been off to the airport. So it was a great trip. And the fly then was Fatagorva,
yeah, which
is brown and black. There was brown in the river. And I remember some of them hadn't got Fatagorva, so I tied them. Fred hadn't got any Fatagorvas. He was going, oh, the lads have caught fish. And I said, don't worry. And I remember tying him 2 Fatagorvas. And in the next 2 hours, I think, or 3 hours, he caught 3 fish. But that salmon fishing, mate, it's what I'm trying to say. You can't force it like other sorts of fishing. If the conditions are good, make hay while the sun shines. If they're bad, you better have a passion for whiskey, or that's just salmon fishing.
I tell you what's really interesting, though, that you've brought out from that, and what comes out to me as you talked about the fishing, but also being a good host and looking after your guests. The fishing's tough. You're not going through the motions. You're finding fishing for them. You're looking after them. You're tying the flies for them, and then getting them on the fish as well. And that's a really important part, I guess, of being a host as well, and can easily be overlooked, I guess, can't it?
Yes, I mean, look, as a host, you can't change the form of the river. It's beyond your influence. The only thing that you can influence is the quality of the service and the level of knowledge that you've got. Now, I get lots of people come here. You know, a lot of people, some of the Scandi guys that come, you hear rumours in the valley, they're all casting champions. All of them. They've all won this and won that. I mean, it's impossible, mate. There aren't enough championships going. But anyway, so these hot shots come down. The reason that they catch so many fish is they're good. They do cast. I mean, in comparison to our British clients, the Norwegians and the Swedes are much better casters, much better. And of course, they understand the subtle differences between salmon fishing in the UK and over here, where generally, you know, the fish want to fly faster. And there's a lot of 24 hours a day fishing here. And it's that. They just fish, they just bomb the water to bits, and they're just fishing and fishing and fishing and fishing, and they're relentless. And so I really don't want to run a fishery. I don't run a fishery for those people. There are places on the river where they can go and fish. But my customers, our customers, we've got all sorts. Of course, we've got some red hot fishermen that come here regularly, and they're really good, but they fit in. They get on with the other people. They're not trying to pull strokes on them all the time, because I won't allow it. It's as simple as that. The way I run the fishing here is the way I would like to experience it myself. And yes, we want people here of a certain culture, of a certain mentality, which is people who will mix, people who will enjoy the magic, who will share their knowledge with others, celebrate with other people when they catch a fish and commiserate when they lose one. That's the atmosphere here. There's magic here in the summer. It crackles. There's magic. It's been going since 1882. It's an unbelievable place. It's like the Hotel California. You check out any time you like, but you can never leave. And I never did. And you know, me and Anna-Marie, we there is an element of destiny in it. It's what we do. I don't do it for money, I can tell you that. I don't personally have any money out of it. We do it because the family have done this for a long time. And the river, it needs people who care about it, Pete. It does. So, for example, to try and even the odds, I had two American fellas came a couple of years ago, and I can tell you lots of stories like this. And they were steelhead fishermen. They'd never been fishing for Atlantic salmon before in their lives. And I knew that the river was at such a height, it was in flood actually, but I knew that the fish in our home pool would be very close to the bank and it would suit these guys. So I said, when they got here, I said, we got their stuff together. I said, lads, have you fished for salmon? No. I said, okay, listen. Normally, I'd spend some time exploring, you know, the theory of salmon fishing and trying to acquaint you with the theory of what you've got to do. But what I want you to do now is get down to that river, get to that pool that I've just showed you, start fishing. I'll bring the dog in a minute. I'll make you some coffee. Just start casting. I said to the lad, I said, can you get 15 yards out, 20 yards? He said, yeah. I said to his father-in-law, Joe, can you do that? Yes. I said, okay, go and fish the way I described to you. As I arrived at the pool, the young guy on his first cast was playing a 20-pound salmon. Or he just put it back, actually. They're literally just releasing it. And that knowledge and certainty of that only comes with time by the water and with a certain amount of experience at the river. But I want those people to have just as good as an experience as all the hot shots. I know the hot shots can catch fish. They don't need my intervention. There's not that much that I can teach them, to be honest. So I tend to enjoy their company and try and learn a little bit from them. But the people who are lesser mortals, who don't have as much time to spend on fishing, they're the ones where I can tip the balance. And so that's what I try to do. And one of the things that we do here, where I've said you can't force salmon fishing, but the truth is that there is something that we do that helps. And that is that we have resting periods here. I won't allow people to flog the water 24 hours a day. So in June and July, I close the river twice a day for 4 hours at a time. And I get everybody off the water. But what's interesting, Pete, is me and Anna-Marie did the stats. Over 75% of our fish are caught after a resting period. The enforced ones. No one else on the river does it. And that's why, if you come to the Gowler River, if you're any good, you've got a good choice of where to go. If you're not that good, come here.
Nice. Lovely. Matt, it sounds...
They'll chew you up and spit you out, Matt. I'm not joking, they will. Because these guys, they've got an engine that you can't compete with unless, certainly you're in your 20s or early 30s. They're mad. Yeah. They're raving mad. Because in Scandinavia, you've got to understand, you know, they always say we'll sleep in the winter. And they mean that. But we run a fishery for everybody. And we've got many, many Scandinavian customers that come here and really, really enjoy it. But we tend to attract people of a certain way of thinking. And I expect our experienced anglers to muck in, help out, and, you know, just be part of the party. And they are. They're wonderful. Trouble is, they all become friends.
Yeah. Nice.
You know, it's hard to have a business mentality when they're all your mates.
That's absolutely fantastic. You've got me, the Gowler's been on my list, and it's got me chomping at the bit, and I'm going to come knocking at some stage as well. I know that. If people who are listening to this, and I think, you know, the way that you run the lodge and the fishing and the fish are not just a product for people to go catch, it's quite clear you care about those deeply as well, hence the resting and everything else that goes with it. But if people want to come and fish with you out there, how do they get in touch with you?
Well, the place is called Wind's Nest Fly Fishing Lodge. The house here, the big house where we house our guests, was built in 1882. And in that year, the first overseas fishers came, John Gordon and his party. Gordon was fishing in this valley from, I think, about late 1850s to 1860s. So he was here a long time. In 1882, the Wind's Nest family moved out of the original Wind's Nest farm and split the property, literally moved parts of it, including parts of the buildings here. But they built a new house called Storstu, which means big house, in 1882, and the first salmon fishermen stayed here then. So it's been going on a very long time. If you want to find us, just look for Wind's Nest Fly Fishing Lodge on Facebook. That's where you get the most up-to-date info. We have got a website called gowlersalmon.com, but for all the sort of latest info, Wind's Nest Fly Fishing Lodge. And if on either the website or on the Facebook page you hit the contact us button, it will come through to me or Anna Morit. And she tends to deal with the bookings. I tend to deal with the fishing questions and, you know, the management of the fishery, which, you know, we're very lucky. We've got 4 kilometres of water, which are all in a row. So there are places on Gowler which have got slightly more water than us in some cases, like Norwegian fly fishers, for example. But ours is one continuous length, both banks. And that's a rare thing on Gowler. But it's a wonderful thing because we've probably got, for fly fishing anyway, I can't think of any water that's really better. And I'm biased, of course, but it's like if you ask a golfer to design a pro golf course, you know, the bunker will be there and the fairways, this salmon river, this part here is built for fly fishing. But there are some very other good places you can go, particularly you've got Norwegian fly fishers who operate not far away from us. And, you know, we get on really well. I get on well with Per and the guys that work down there, Daniel and Tees, they're good people, and they believe in many of the similar things to us. You've got Uni Roja running Gowler fly fishing lodge for mainly further down, but he's got some water above the Galfoss, close to Sturren. Good fishing operation. So it's, I'm being a bit flippant when I say come to us, but certainly my advice is that you want to make sure if you're coming to fish the Gowler that there's no fishing on the far bank, that there's no spin fishing if you're a fly fisherman. That's very important. So do your due diligence before you book, because I've spoken to many people who've had wonderful experiences on this river, but I've spoken to people who've had horror stories as well. No excuse for not doing your homework with the tools available to you now. Use Facebook and use Google.
Matt, thanks very much for that. We've covered so much, and there was so much more I wanted to ask you, but I'm going to end with one last question. Would you change anything?
No, mate. No. Not 1 second. Yes, of course, hindsight's a great thing. I might have conducted myself better perhaps in certain relationships and left less of a trail of devastation in my wake at times. But really, nah, it's been brilliant. Pete, I've lived the dream. I really have lived the dream. I mean, you can't be ungrateful for that, can you? I've gone with the stream. I'm still going with it. I don't know where I'll end up. That's the thing. I think I'll be here. I'm pretty sure I'll be here. But, that's been the thing. Never say never, they say. And you never know where that stream's going to take you. It's shaped my life. I'm really seriously contemplating writing a book at the moment called Going with the Stream, about my life, because I came across a load of transparencies, slides of the days of yore the other day when I was clearing out my house in the UK, and I've got thousands and thousands of transparencies. So I'm going to scan them, restore them in Lightroom, and retouch them all, and then make them part of this book that I'm going to create, possibly in 2 parts, possibly splitting the coarse fishing and the fly fishing years, because I think great fishermen do a bit of both, but it's not a large number of people. So your book publisher's not going to particularly want to kind of mix the metaphor so much. I don't know. I'll have a think, but I will do the book. It probably will be called Going with the Stream, and it will be about
Brilliant. Well, I'd like to thank you, as I said, for the TV programs, and it has been the soundtrack of my daughter growing up, and she's a bit older now, but we used to, as I say, genuinely watch them all. I can remember so many of them. So I'd like to thank you for that. And I'd also like to obviously thank you for being a guest, but being so open about everything that you talked about. It's been really, really fascinating listening to you, Matt. So thank you so much for that.
It's a pleasure, sir. And please pass on my best to your daughter, because, fishing is changing. There's a lot of women coming into fishing at the moment, and it's a very, very healthy thing, that is. It's a very broad church, fishing. It's the one thing I know where it doesn't matter what politics you are, it doesn't matter what sex, background, what football team you support, what the colour of your skin is. None of those things matter. All that matters is that you feel at peace when you've got that piece of carbon and cork in your hand. And long may it be so.
Matt Hayes, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for listening to the Fly Culture podcast. I hope you'll enjoy this one as much as I have done. It's been absolutely fabulous. So we've got plenty more planned. So tune in soon to listen to the Fly Culture podcast.